So good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fourth installment of the Boundless Judaism lecture series here at Temple Israel. Tonight we are going to be looking at the category, the concept of Chochmah, the concept of wisdom. If you were here last week, or if you picked up the handout from last week, you'll know that last week we were looking at Bina, understanding, and later on we will also be looking at Dea, at knowledge, at knowing. And these three concepts are interrelated and connected, but we're going to focus just on the one for tonight. You'll have to wait for the next, actually is it the next one, or not what's the 14th, the January 14th is when we'll be doing the next of these three, and then it will all become clear. But bear with us as we work on Chochmah for tonight, on wisdom. And we're also going to have to deal with the fact that the Jewish conception of wisdom, the Jewish conception of Chochmah, is a little different than that topic in English. There is overlap, but there is also distinction. So please come to this with a clean, fresh slate, and we'll see what we get. So, there we are, Chochmah. So Chochmah, wisdom, and I'll be using the terms interchangeably throughout, is gained through the application of information and experience in order to choose the best course of action in any situation. Now, that may sound very familiar. That is a part that overlaps with the Western concept of wisdom. That wisdom is knowing the right thing to do at the right time. And that it is gained through understanding, through the application of information, through experiences that have gone before. The next phrase is the key one for Judaism that's going to provide a different spin on this topic. Wisdom is received, revealed, and crafted on an individual basis. The notion of wisdom being not only something that is created, not only something that is gleaned on an individual, but it's something that is received, that wisdom can be transmitted, is a very important concept in Jewish thinking, as we are going to see. So we're going to start with a look at the greatest compendium of wisdom within the biblical texts, which is, of course, the book of Proverbs. If you've never gotten to the book of Proverbs, apart from Eshet Chayil, apart from the last chapter that is sung on Friday nights, if you've never spent any time just reading through its beautiful verses about wisdom and about the good course of life, you now have homework. Because we're only going to touch the surface of it, but the book of Proverbs is an amazing, amazing collection and introduction to the concept of wisdom. So it serves very well to start us off. So it begins, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction. He's explaining why he wrote the book. It's in fact one of the only books of the Bible that gives its own explanation of why it was bothered to be written. To comprehend the words of understanding, to receive the discipline of wisdom, justice and right and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion, that the wise man may hear and increase in learning, and the man of understanding may attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and a figure, meaning like an aphorism or an allegory, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. Dark doesn't mean dark foreboding, but dark means it's cryptic or difficult to understand. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but the foolish despise wisdom and discipline. Now that next to last phrase, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, that Yirat Hashem, Reshit Chochmah, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, may sound a little strange to us. Because after all, shouldn't the beginning of wisdom be experience? Shouldn't the beginning of wisdom be thinking about life? What in the world would the connection between us and God, of our awe of God, have to do with opening us up to the process and the conduits of wisdom? Well, as Mishlei is going to explain, and hopefully more of this evening as well, the notion that wisdom is not only about us crawling and stumbling towards God, but also about God trying to imbue us with understanding, with wisdom, with a way of knowing the world, is central to our complete understanding of Judaism. And recognizing that there is God, holding God in awe, as we said all the way back in our first lecture on Keter, on the crown, is the beginning of being open to the fact that wisdom will come from external sources, not only from our own reflections. Now, it may sound funny to say wisdom is not in books when we are reading from the book of Proverbs, but the book of Proverbs itself is trying to get us to understand that. As it says in chapter 8, the Lord made me. This is wisdom personified. This is wisdom speaking to the reader. The Lord made me, says wisdom, at the beginning of his way. Before his works of old, I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. Wisdom predates creation. So think about that for a second. If we only thought of wisdom as being our application of understanding upon our experiences, then wisdom could not exist prior to the creation in which our experiences were happening. But if wisdom is something that predates, that pre-exists creation, then all of a sudden we have a different reason for looking for external sources of wisdom. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth or the fields, or the primal dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master craftsman. Wisdom is a partner in creation. It is not only a result of our reflection upon it, which means that wisdom can then be imparted, can be revealed, not only claimed by man. Wisdom is not just a product of our life, it is something that can be a gift to us in life. I'm going to come back again and again and again. The idea that wisdom can be revealed, that wisdom can be granted, that wisdom can be transmitted is crucial to understanding Judaism as a whole. And I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men. Again, this is wisdom speaking in its own personification, its anthropomorphism of the concept of wisdom itself. But think for a second of that idea that wisdom wants to be a partner with us. Wisdom yearns, but almost there as an eager bystander in the process of creation, hoping that that which is created will become a partner to it, so that they may be together, wisdom and the creation. And we are the sons of men, we are that which was created, and wisdom is our partner, if we choose to make it so. Wisdom is the attunement then with the ways of creation. And wisdom was there as creation was being made, which means creation was made according to wisdom. And that means the wiser we become, the more we access wisdom, the closer we come to understanding creation in its most primal sense. Wisdom is our guide and our goal in all things. It shapes our lives through its instructions and through our pursuit. The way we try to attain wisdom changes the way we live our lives. And by changing the way we live our lives, we live better. The pursuit of wisdom creates secondary, tangible benefits, which is why study is so important. Coming along so far? Yes? Okay. There we go. So another quote from the very beginning. My son, this is the author, Shlomo, speaking to the reader. If sinners entice you, don't go along. Good advice. Sounds like a wise person might say that. If they say, come with us, we'll set up an ambush for blood. We'll hide to catch the innocent scot-free. We'll swallow them alive like the grave, whole like those who descend into the pit. All valuables are to be found. We'll fill our houses with plunder. Cast in your lot among us. We'll share in one purse. Right. This is the opposite of wisdom. And that is what Shlomo was trying to make clear. That the enticement of the world, the enticement to do wrong, to choose to do the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong way, is because you think you will benefit from it. You'll think you'll be able to fatten your purse. And people will entice us to do that. But that's not the enticement we should be listening to. The enticement we should be listening to is the enticement of wisdom. And wisdom proclaims its message in the street. This is again a quote from the book of Proverbs. It raises its voice in the squares, at the head of the noisy markets, at the entrances to the gates, and everywhere in the city. Wisdom speaks its words. This, again, image of wisdom as being a woman, as it is usually personified in the text, as being a woman standing in the marketplace, screaming out and offering all that she has to any of the passerby, saying, come, learn, understand, your life will improve. Wisdom is not hiding in a cave. Wisdom is not buried in the library. Wisdom is not taken away to the heaven only to be gained by sense. Wisdom is there in the markets, in the real world, waiting for us to answer its call. And it is not asking us to separate from the world. It is asking us to walk in the world according to its ways, according to the ways the world was formed. Yes? Good. And our answer, says Mishlei, should be, say to wisdom, you are my sister. That we should respond to wisdom as our most loving response to our dearest friend, our dearest sister. And say, yes, you are mine and I am yours, and together we will live in this world. Together we will have this partnership. Which now brings us down to the concrete. So we have this focus on wisdom. How does it express itself through the 4 different categories that we have been doing so far through our Boundless course? Well, let's take a look at liturgy. Liturgically, as part of our religious rites and ceremonies, not merely as study, if you could use the term merely to describe study, we read from the Torah and the Haftarah. Right? 3 times a week, more if it's a holiday, we are reading from these books. We constantly seek wisdom in our text, and we read it as a spiritual pathway. Right? The readings that we do in the sanctuary and in our chapels and in our Bati Midrash are not done just as a technical exercise. They're done as a spiritual endeavor. And the pomp and ceremony that goes along with how we read them in these liturgical settings is meant to underscore this. The verses and the melodies highlight God's majesty and God's intimacy. Right, the Torah service on Shabbat starts off, Ein kamocha ba'Elohim. Why does it start off like that? That's how you greet the king. Right? You don't just say, hi, Your Majesty. You don't just say, oh, no, okay, we're gonna go ahead and read something now. You want to make sure that of all the parts of the service, this part is going to be trumpeted in a way that grabs the attention. That is the majesty part. But what happens a paragraph down? The melody switches. And what does it switch on? Which word? Av, which means Father. Right? Ein kamocha ba'Elohim. Who is like among the gods? Booming, majestic. Right? Adonai Melech. God is king. Booming, majestic. Av harachamim. Father of compassion. We want to have both the majesty and the intimacy because we understand that by having both of those, we reach closer towards this goal of wisdom. The verses echo the Ark of the Covenant. Right? Vayahivim so as the ark was lifted. That's at the beginning of our Torah service, even on the non-Shabbos days. And at the very end of the Torah service, Umnachol Yomar is the very next verse of the Torah. And we have made bookends out of it. So that we start the Torah service with the allusion to the Ark of the Covenant, and we end the Torah service with the allusion to the Ark of the Covenant. And what happens in the middle is the content of the Ark of the Covenant. Despite what you may have seen in Steven Spielberg, it's not melting rays that come out and kill Nazis. It's Torah that's in the middle. It's wisdom that comes forth out of the Ark, and we still have access to it even if we have lost the Ark, which the raiders are trying to find. But we are still getting the contents. The Torah is carried out among the people. Yes.
Would it be appropriate to say that the liturgical reading of the Torah is the revealed wisdom?
It's a very good way to put it back in, put the revealed.
Yeah, the study of Torah is where our pursuit is.
So as Michael was pointing out, you could parse this a little bit more tightly and say that the liturgical reading of Torah is the emphasis on revealed wisdom, on the fact that God has granted us Torah. And the study of Torah, and we're going to talk about Torah in its biggest sense later, is more of the pursuit of wisdom, the reason path of wisdom. And that's a very good way of putting it. Although both play parts in each other's domains as well. We're never only doing one or the other. And that marriage of revealed and reasoned is going to be becoming more apparent later, right, as I hope. And the Torah is carried around, again, to highlight this notion of its intimacy, of its accessibility, and of its responsibility to everybody who is there and participating. The Torah doesn't only belong to the rabbi, and the Torah is not only the rabbi's responsibility. This is not some secret priest cult where only the select few get to read the sacred texts. This is wisdom for everyone, and this is wisdom that everyone is responsible for knowing. The blessings proclaim God's blessedness, to remind ourselves that this is not just a random book, but of its ultimate source, and the Torah is accompanied by guards and is always the center of attention. Pro tip, when you're in the sanctuary, the Torah is going around, eyes on the Torah. Right? We may want to say hello to people around us, that's fine. You say hello to them as you turn and continue to face the Torah. But what is the difference between the Torah as a set of laws and the Torah as a concept of wisdom? Well, the Torah is not a law book. I know people say it's the book of the law of Moses, and it's the term that's used all over and again, but it's not really what we mean. It does contain laws, but it's not a law book. The Torah is not a history, despite its many narratives which give the history of our people. That was not its purpose. The Torah is a channel for wisdom. The Torah is meant to give us wisdom, not just to give us laws, not just to give us history. But wisdom, that inspired guide for right action, must be cultivated through law and history. You can't just get wisdom all on its own. Which is why, if I were to take a poll, I'm not going to embarrass anyone, if I were to ask you who here has read from the Torah, that is to say, read any section of it, or listened during the service, or read it along as the Torah is chanted, I'd bet you're going to get a lot of hands in this room. And if I ask you who here has sat and read any part of the book of Proverbs other than the quotes I just showed, I'd probably have a lot fewer hands in the room. Because we recognize that the Torah in its perfection is a combination of both the wisdom and a perfect vehicle for that wisdom. Whereas the book of Proverbs, despite the greatness of Shlomo HaMelech, of King Solomon, because it is pure and rarefied wisdom, because it doesn't contain a sense of law or a sense of narrative, is much harder for us to digest, to take in and appreciate and hold on to. Law tells us the general principle of right and wrong, and history gives us examples of good and bad choices, and then a background for our own, and we put it together through our understanding of the Torah, through what has been revealed, and that is what we call wisdom. Yes.
Some seems very obvious. So
That's fine.
Or is what is an alternative way of looking at this? How does this compare to? Maybe this is obvious. What's the alternative?
What's the other way to look at the Torah?
No, at wisdom.
What's the other way to look at wisdom? The other way to look at wisdom is the self-created understanding of how to live a good life. Period. I have lived 80 years, and I haven't really. I don't look that good for my. I've lived 80 years, and I've noticed all the things that have happened, and this is my understanding of everything, and that's why I do what I do. And you call me wise because I'm usually right, but it is something that is wholly self-generated. Maybe I had the good fortune to listen to a few of the other people tell me about when the rains come or when to plant the wheat or things like that. But much of what you consider my wisdom comes purely from experience. And that is why for most cultures, most civilizations, who was put in charge of the town council? The elders, right? They were wise by virtue of not being dead. They had lived long enough so they had a greater repository of understanding was the assumption, and therefore their advice was valued more. And essentially, the system of Torah, while still saying we need to revere and respect our elders, and Judaism holds elders in very high esteem, says that there is another step to this that is connected to revelation. And it doesn't exactly short-circuit the life experiences, but it jumpstarts it in a way that's very, very important. We're going to get back to that point in just a little bit. The Haftarah, similarly, although its origins are a little murky, and we can talk about that some other time, but when we read from this selection from the prophets, we are looking for inspiration and a guide to our emotions. And I know that many people use the Haftarah as a chance to take a nap, as a chance to maybe just relax and think about life a little bit more generally. But the words of the prophets are not there just as filler space after the Torah reading. They're not just a holdover or an echo from an earlier time when we weren't allowed to read the Torah itself. They are kept, read, and meant to inspire and guide us emotionally. Because wisdom is not merely an analytical ability. Wisdom requires a great deal of depth to our emotions. And then the words of the prophets provide that emotional counterpoint beautifully to the words of the Torah. All right, so let's get to this other question about revelation in more depth, of how this works. So the history section of tonight is going to focus on Chazal, on the what we call the Tanaim and the Moraim. We're going to get back to those words in a minute, but I want to get to Chazal, which is the more classical description of this category of time. And Chazal, like many things in Judaism, is an acronym. It's the Chachamim, Zichronam, Livracha. The sages, may their memory be a blessing. So you take the from Chachamim, you take the Z from Zichronam, and you take the Livracha, you take the L from Livracha, you put them together, and what do you get? Chazal. Right, so Chazal is the common parlance for this category of sage. But we can also call them just Chachamim, just the wise ones. You'll note that it comes from the same root as the word for wisdom. And if you want in English, we can call them the sages, because calling them the wise ones just doesn't sound right in English, because that's English's shortcut. So we're going to take a look at this remarkable period of time. And it focused on, why didn't bring up the whole thing? It focuses on the oral law. Chazal, the Chachamim, the sages, were considered to be the keepers of the oral tradition, the keepers of the oral wisdom that went along with the written Torah. The written Torah, all of us are familiar with. It sits in the ark in the sanctuary. It sits in the Chumash. Anybody can open it up. Anybody can read it. The oral wisdom is that which was transmitted from one teacher to a student, from a student to the next student, and so on and so forth. And they go together according to Jewish understanding. That you don't have a full Torah in the broadest sense of its word until you have both the written and the oral explanation. And as Pirkei Avot explains, Moses received the Torah at Sinai. And here they mean not just the written Torah, but the oral explanation as well, and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua transmitted it to the elders to the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. And the Great Assembly eventually is transmitting it to those students that come afterwards, which go generation to generation to generation, and continues to this very day. We're okay so far? There we are. But why do we need it? Why do we even believe that there is such a thing as the oral explanation, as the oral tradition? Well, did anyone recognize what this is? No? Oh, people. These are IKEA instructions. Right? IKEA has an interesting challenge for its business model, because they create furniture that is flat packed. In order to keep the prices down, they have to make it so that the furniture is completely disassembled and fits into a flat box, so they can fill up every square inch of those giant shipping crates that are on the big freighters. That way they can keep down the shipping costs for shipping all over the world. But that means that when it gets to your house, when you go to the IKEA and you pick it up and you bring it home, you get a piece of paper like this that tells you how to put it together. And because IKEA does business everywhere in the world, that's what you get. You get the diagrams. Right? There's no point writing out the words in English, because any attempt to explain it in English is going to have to be repeated in French, and repeated in German, and repeated in Japanese, and repeated in every other language all around the world where they have stores. But that's what you get. What's that? You get a visual. You get a visual. That's the written Torah. That's what all of us get. We all get the unexplained, straightforward diagram of what life is meant to be. And most of us stare at it like this and end up calling tech support. Which every IKEA instruction has this lovely little image as well. Which is when you stare blankly at the instructions in the box, you should pick up the phone and call. Picking up the phone and calling IKEA is the equivalent of picking up our tradition and asking your rabbi, Rabbi, what does this mean? And having the explanation transmitted orally. There is a reason why the Talmud is multiple times longer than the Torah. Because an explanation of any one sentence, by definition, has to be longer than the sentence itself. As if the sentence was self-explanatory, you wouldn't have needed the additional explanation. Now, we believe the sentence is self-explanatory once you know how to explain it. But that's why we need the oral tradition. That's why we need the oral transmission. That's why this wisdom has to come prepackaged and revealed, as opposed to purely self-generated. And that's why Jewish understanding of wisdom relies much more on community, much more on tradition, much more on what is shared between one and the other. Because what happens is that we put it all together to make a totality of what we call Torah, or what we understand about what God has given us. So in Brachot, in the Talmud, it asks, what is the meaning of the verse? And I will give you the tablets of stone, and the law, and the commandment, which I have written, so that you can teach them. Why didn't the Torah just say, our sages asked, I'll give you the tablets? Why not? Each of these phrases has meaning. The tablets? Yes, those are the 10 Commandments, the big stone tablets that you're used to seeing from all the movies. The law? This is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. But we still have these other words called the commandments that came later. What's that? That's the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first compilation, and we'll talk about this in just a bit more, the first compilation of the oral law, of the oral explanation of the Torah. That I have written. That is the additional exhortation, clarification, and inspiration that comes from the prophets and the writings. That you may teach them, which is the ultimate purpose. This is the Gemara, or what we call, together with the Mishnah, the Talmud. Altogether, that's what was given at Sinai. Because without those pieces, we have incomplete wisdom. Simple thought experiment. If we believe that the Torah was written by God, that's not really something we should be saying yes or no to, but if we believe the Torah was written by God, and if we believe that God is a perfect author, then we believe the Torah is a perfect book. But if the Torah is a perfect book, then it should be perfectly understood by the reader. You would call a book bad if you couldn't understand it. Like, I don't understand what the author's trying to say here. This is absolute gibberish. So if the Torah is perfect, then it should be perfectly understood. And yet, around the world, there are many, many people who read our Torah and come to very, very different understandings of its precepts, of its stories, of its laws, of everything that's in it. Well, if we want to believe that God gave us a perfect understanding, then we must posit that there was a companion key, a code, a legend, whatever you want to call it. Legend means like what goes at the bottom of a map, that helps us understand the written part. And to recognize that that has to be transmitted along with the book itself, along with the written component. Why? The Torah and Torah can mean 2 different things. The Torah, capital T, capital T, capital T, is the 5 books of Moses. Right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The Torah. The Torah sits in the ark. Torah refers to our unpacking of that code. So when you said I'm studying Torah, you're studying that whole universe that goes around it. And we're doing it according to the wisdom of our sages and our rational faculties tempered in debate. And this is something that Chazal, this is something that this generation included or added, in a sense, to our style of relating to our text that has become critical to our understanding of wisdom as a whole. Debate.
Yeah. Here I read, Torah refers to our unpacking of the code.
Yes.
That means the code that embedded in the plain text of Torah, or we're talking about different kind of code?
We're talking about the kind of code, meaning if it says, if someone does damage to you, you do eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. What does that really mean? That's the unpacking we're talking about.
But
We're not talking about computer codes. We're not talking about the number codes or your equal distance skips of letters. We're talking about the basic meaning. Needs unpacking to be understood.
But you believe that there is a code embedded into Torah?
That's another lecture. That's another lecture. I can't give a short answer to that one, so that's another lecture. All right, so Torah refers to that unpacking, meaning the broadest sense of our wisdom means you can't just open the Torah, the 5 books, read it, and understand it. And on the other hand, even if someone has explained it to you, you're still not done. Even if you have both the written and an oral explanation from a rabbi, you still need to then temper that with discussion and debate. You need to bring what is now your understanding against someone else's understanding. Let the sparks fly, without acrimony, without anger, without being an argument in the sense of me against you, but of rubbing together our two understandings so that we can see what it means. Now, as Shria HaGaon said, this is one of the great sages from after this period, who was looking back on the history of only a few hundred years before him. He was a little closer to events than us. He said the Mishnah. Well, each sage had received the import of Torah from their teachers and then transmitted it and so on and so forth. Right? So everybody had a teacher. I'm maybe the rabbi for you, or maybe you're just visiting us here for tonight, but I teach you something. Or we can take, for example, the children of our religious school. And I sit them down and I try to explain to them, this is what it means to keep kosher. Yes, the Torah says it briefly, but here's all the details you need to know. About separate pots, separate pans, and waiting periods, and all that kind of detail. We're going to talk about keeping kosher in more detail later. I'm going to explain it in my own way. Now, my explanation is not going to be substantively different than someone else's explanation. But my style will be different, and the style will be different according to both me and according to the student. As I have to change the tactic, find a different allegory, come up with different wordings as is needed by each and every class or each and every individual. You understand that? Right? That's what we call teaching. That's what we call learning. What Shria HaGaon captured for us, reminded us, was that this was an ongoing process. That the oral law that was given at Mount Sinai was not given in a singular, perfect, pristine form, just like the written Torah was given. It was given as a set of explanations that then each teacher had to continue to rework while preserving the content in different ways in order to reach each student. Right? I can teach that 2 + 2 = 4 100 different ways for 100 different students. Still going to end up with them knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. But if you look at my lesson plan, it would look different. Got that? So what he said is that the form they used to teach it varied. And the Mishnah, that which we now have as the earliest written record of this process, was the compilation that was considered the best record of the law until that point. Because they realized at a certain point that it was getting harder and harder to maintain a clear understanding of what the oral tradition was. And so they felt they needed to write it down. And when they did that, Yehuda HaNasi, the rabbi at the time who did the compilation, did the editing, went through and said, what is the best phrasing, the best articulation of each of the points of Jewish law, of Jewish understanding, of Jewish wisdom until this point. And I will organize them and put them together, and that is what we have now as the mission. You okay on that point? Because if not, it gets real confusing if we don't. Okay. But even though we have then that beautifully clear codification of what the actual wisdom was that was meant to be to help us unpack the Torah, there are still points that need further discussion, debate, and clarification, what we call a machloket, a dispute. And so to ensure an accurate understanding of the wisdom of the Torah in each generation, they, meaning the Chachamim, meaning our sages, the wise ones, laid down a pattern that we would have formal argumentation. We would have formal debates, formal discussions, and there would be rules for what was considered a proof text, what was considered a refutation, what was considered a valid form of an argument. And that would then help us to find the actual rulings and implementation of the law of the wisdom, as it were, in each and every event. Making sense there? Right? So it's not just memorize this, then memorize that, and you're done. It was memorize this, understand it, and then share it with someone else, and when they understand it differently, fight, and between you, you'll end up with wisdom. Yes, we have a similar process in the American legal system. Right, why do we have prosecutors and defending attorneys? This is a belief that an adversarial legal system will create an answer that is closest to the truth. Rather than simply having somebody say, you know what, I like the way he works. I make you bet he's right. Or he speaks more eloquently, therefore he's right. It's not about how eloquently he speaks. What arguments were provided, what refutations were made. And then the other side does the same. And wisdom is to be found in passing on to them the tradition, this revelation, this part that was revealed, and of wrestling with it in the present. You need both parts. All right, yeah, beautiful little picture. So according to Ben Zillman and Pirkei Avot, who is wise? What is the definition of someone that is wise? Now you might have thought, who's wise? The guy that's memorized all this. The guy who's learned the whole oral tradition. The guy who knows the Torah front and back. That would be the wise person. Or who is the oldest person in the room must be the wisest person. No, it's not the wise person. The wise person is the one who learns from all people. Who learns from every source that is available. For it is said, from all those who taught me I gained understanding. Taken from Psalm 119. Why a picture of an owl? Why was an owl considered to be a wise creature? Look at the eyes. Look at the eyes. The owl sees everything. The owl learns from all sources.
He observes.
He observes. Very observant. Exactly.
Very.
The owl absorbs from all places. Wisdom is not about just limiting yourself to one source, which is why in the Mishnah, and especially in the Talmud, we don't just record the answers, we record disputes. Rabbi so-and-so said such, Rabbi so-and-so disagreed. And here's their arguments back and forth. That's an amazing statement of belief in what it is to be wise. Rather than simply saying wisdom is, do is what we said at the very end. Wisdom is knowing how we got to the end, so that you can replicate it for yourself in some unforeseen circumstance. Wisdom becomes then more of a process, rather than merely something that is learned. Again, which is why Jews are much better debaters than they are quoters of the book of Proverbs. We took that to heart. All right, so Atana, let's just get a few technical terms out of here. Atana is one of the categories of sages, the earliest generation, essentially stretching from around the time of Herod the Great, not so great, and a little bit before him, during the last of the Hashmonean dynasty. That was the dynasty of kings that came from the Maccabees. And they lasted until around the time the Mishnah was done, around the time the 250 CE. And according to the rules of disputation, a Tana can argue with a Tana. But a later sage cannot argue retroactively with an earlier one. So a Tana can fight a Tana, And if you bring two different proof texts, one from one rabbi of this age, one from another rabbi of that age, then you have to work out more details and figure out who's right. And their main goal was to explain the Torah as clearly as possible, transmit this oral wisdom, and their explanations and interpretations are considered authoritative. There's a reason why we're lighting 8 candles for Hanukkah. Because according to our record of the tradition, the Tanaim said that's what we do. Now they argued about it. One group of Tanaim said you should light 8 candles first night, and then 7 candles the next night, and 6 candles the next night, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And another group of Tanaim said you should light 1 the first night, and 2 the next night, and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Which one did we end up following? The second one, exactly. But if we had been not given that second opinion, we would all be lighting it the other way. And even if you thought you had a better way, if there was something explicitly, clearly, and universally acknowledged as having been established by the Tanaim, you don't get to change them. Because that level of wisdom is not up for grabs. That has been received, not to be messed with. And even their immediate, what's the right word? Not predecessors, but successors, thank you. Even their immediate successors, the Amoraim, didn't get to argue with the Tanaim. So even though they only lived a few decades and then centuries later, if an Amora had a point that contradicted a Tana, the Amora lost. Just automatically. It didn't matter if he thought it was a better explanation. It didn't matter if it sounded more logical. If they could find a Tanaitic source, a quote from the Mishnah or a quote from another teachings of that previous generation that contradicted the later rabbi lost. Because the wisdom of the previous generation was considered inviolable. And those who came after the Amoraim, they lose if the Amora contradicts them. If the accepted opinion among the Amora. So I said there are lots of debates and discussions, so not every opinion of every rabbi in the Talmud or the Mishnah is the opinion that wins. But among those opinions that win, from within their respective generations, we don't get to contradict. But we do have to continue to try and explain, which is what the Amoraim were doing. These are the rabbis who are in the Talmud. These are the rabbis who took what the Tanaim had given them, took the Mishnah, and said, well, that's very nice and well. It says you have to light the candles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But let's see if we can work out all of those details. What happens if you don't have enough oil? Do you only light one? Do you save it all up and light on the first day, or do you light it all on the 8th day? What if you have enough oil to light all 8, but your neighbor only has no oil? Is it better for you to light all of your candles and let him have none, or should you do the minimum of 1 and give him enough oil so he can light as well? By the way, that second one is the correct answer. But these were questions that needed to be answered. Because, as I said, the Mishnah did not contain explicitly all of the answers to these questions. It was considered to be implicit, and it was considered to be an implicit echo of the information that was contained implicitly within the Torah itself. Now you know why I use that IKEA instruction as the example. It gets a little complicated. It's called life. Life is complicated. And if you think you can attain wisdom just by memorizing a book, you're in trouble. And if you think you can attain wisdom only on your own, you're in trouble. That's why we have the teachings of our sages. So what's the legacy of this historical period of the Tanaim and the Amoraim? Well, the Chachamim, these sages, established a balanced system of tradition and reason that enabled Judaism to survive and even thrive despite centuries of oppression and dislocation. They knew we needed more than memorization or reason would provide just by themselves. We needed a system. We needed a consistent way to follow a path that would generate wisdom in every single generation and for every single situation. They polished and smoothed our understanding. They honed our rituals and rites. They clarified the application of Torah. They laid out markers on the path to God. And that is the essence of wisdom. when Kathy Swerdlow was talking about the Rishonim and the Achronim last week, she was trying to explain that they were systematizers, that they were analyzers. And one of the reasons why they had that as their primary focus is because the early side of generating the clarity of wisdom had already been taken care of by the Tanaim and the Amoraim. That primary digging work had been done. Think of it, if you will, of a paleontological survey. Think about dinosaur hunters, okay? So you've got a group of dinosaur hunters, and they go out to the Badlands, and they're in the Dakotas, and they're digging up fossils. You've got some that are the primary diggers. Right? These are the guys who are going in to where everything is buried. It's all there, but they have to scrape away all the dirt so that you can see all the bones very, very carefully. And they're very methodical. They categorize, they get everything nice and clean. And then they send it back to the universities. And the universities, you have people who clean it further, right? They make the casts and they polish it, and or maybe not polish it, but they wipe away everything that isn't actually fossil so that it is absolutely pristine. And then they hand it over to the people who analyze it. Say, all right, now we know all the pieces we've got. And out of these, we're going to make a blank slate. And they have to figure out which piece goes with which of the skeletons. And which piece, this is from a different species or is it not a different species? Right, that's how we ended up with Brontosaurus. They made a mistake of trying to make more species than they needed to. That's why Brontosauruses aren't real dinosaurs. That they're not. No such thing as a Brontosaurus. Never tell a paleontologist that you love the Brontosaurus as a favorite dinosaur because it's not a real dinosaur. It's a mistake. No, there's a whole bunch. Anyway, we can talk about that over a couple of coffees sometime. But you have to analyze all of these pieces now and categorize them and systematize them and put them together so that you have something that you can actually put in your museum. And that was the job of those later sages that came after, the Rishonim and the Achronim. So you have the diggers, you have the cleaners, and then you have the categorizers. Make sense? Okay. Onward. Deeds. One of our 4 categories for the Boundless program. Kashrut. You might be thinking to yourself, kashrut and wisdom. Maybe kashrut and mercy, maybe kashrut and kindness. That kind of goes together. But wisdom, chochmah, kashrut, how does this work? Hold on. The wisdom of kashrut is received more than reason. This is one of the ultimate truths of kashrut that is the hardest for most people who are not raised with this understanding to accept. And by raised with this understanding, I don't mean whether you were raised observant or not. Because you can be raised observant and not understand why you're doing it. I'm saying whether or not you understand while you're doing this. That we are receiving the wisdom of kashrut. We did not figure this out on our own. It is a path to guide our most primal act, eating, in ways that without our full knowledge and understanding still lead us to God. Even if you don't know it, keeping kosher brings you closer to God. And that's hard to accept for people that are built around the system of prove it to me and then I'll believe. Not just tell me to accept. So let's go down and say, first of all, what is kashrut? Well, kashrut is first and foremost a system for ranking how we relate to and how we take from the world around us. And you can see there's a progression from what might be considered the lowest order of life, from plants. Everything is available as long as it's edible and not poisonous or deadly or some other way bad. Right? Asparagus to zucchini. A to Z. Right? Asparagus to zucchini, it's all kosher. That's it. You just pick it from the ground and you can eat it. No problem. You can eat an apple on a tree. No problem. There is nothing that needs to be done before you now have permission to eat it. What's that? You don't have to. You can wash it for hygiene. You can wash it for health. But you're not washing it for kashrut.
No.
You're not washing it as part of kashrut. If it's kashrut, you can have the filthiest apple in the world and it's still kosher. It may not be good for you,
Right.
and that's important to understand.
But what if there were bugs in certain?
If they're bugs, that's another
Like
issue.
a lettuce, let's say.
Yes,
You know,
if there are bugs and other things that are a problem, yes. But that's not changing The apple, that's
No, no.
removing the bugs. The apple is inherently kosher, it's just the bugs on it.
Right. Like I'm thinking of a head of lettuce or,
Mhm.
something like that, bugs get.
You gotta get down those little crevices, make sure there's nothing sticking there, yes, absolutely. But the lettuce itself remains
Oh,
unchanged.
yeah.
All right, fish. All fish with fins and scales are okay. Another huge category of animals are life. And in fact, there is no preparation for fish. You can eat live fish. You know those old shows with the college fraternity pranks where you're eating the goldfish live? That's kosher. That's kosher. You pluck the fish out of the aquarium, you tilt your head back, you drop it in your mouth. It's disgusting. I am not recommending it. And please do not try this at home. I have to put that caveat on in here. But it's kosher. Once you have gathered it, it is kosher. By the way, the same also applies for the Sephardim, who still have the tradition of which locusts are kosher. You can eat live locusts, and they are kosher. Again, not you, unless you know a Sephardic rabbi who can tell you which of the locusts are okay. But if you know someone who can, and he gives you a box full of live locusts, you can just shove your hand in the box, pull them out, and gobble them down with the little wings and legs twitching. Yeah. That's fine. There's not much that needs to be done to make fish and that one category of insects kosher. Just a matter of making sure you got the right species. Birds, next level of life, all but 24 that are specifically enumerated in the Torah are okay. Every bird not mentioned in the Torah is considered to be prima facie, a priori, kosher. As long as you slaughter it correctly and remove the blood. That's it. Not too bad. When we get to mammals, which is considered to be the highest, most complicated form of life, then we are now very, very restrictive on what you can take and how you take it. Only now, the most narrow category are considered kosher, which are those with fully cloven hooves that also chew their cud. And there are a few animals that do one or the other, but for most of the animal world, the mammal world, if you're doing one, you're most likely doing the other two. And if you're not doing one, you're not doing the other. It's only 4 exceptions the Torah mentions that are slightly overlap. But basically, they have to do both, and you have to slaughter them precisely, and you have to drain them correctly, and you also have to dress the meat properly, removing the ghilanashe, the sciatic nerve, removing the fats that are around certain parts of certain organs. It's a complicated process. It is not easy to take a sheep and get it to your dinner plate, unlike a fish, which can happen in a matter of minutes. It's going to be a long process to get that sheep into your stomach. And the reason? Well, could we reason this out? Could we have discovered kashrut all on our own? Well, according to Abarbanel in his discussion on Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, no. As he says, God forbid that I should believe that the reason for forbidden foods is medicinal. Sure, most people here have heard this idea before. Oh, well, you know, they didn't have an awful lot of wood in the desert environment, and so if you ate pork, you couldn't cook it properly, and then you'd be subject to trichinosis. Yeah, no. That wasn't the origin of kashrut. If you saw, the pig is just one thing that doesn't get eaten. It's not like that would apply to squirrels. It just doesn't make sense. And yet people continue to trot it out, as little trotters, over and over again as an idea. And Abarbanel already 500 years ago was saying, no, that's not right. God forbid we should think that kashrut is something we could have figured out as a system of trying to be healthy. For were it so, the book of God's law would be in the same class as any of the minor brief medical books. There are longer books written about good nutrition than the Torah. Go to any medical school in this country, go to Amazon, and you'll find, 1,000-page books on nutrition. And the Torah is not a 1,000-page book. Not if you take out all the commentaries and everything. And he's pointing out, it wouldn't be considered an important book on nutrition. And especially if you only included the parts that were about kashrut. It would be a pamphlet. You get better nutritional information from the free racket publics. And he wants to reject that. This is not something we just figured out for our health, from our own reason. Furthermore, our own eyes see that people who eat pork and insects and such are well and alive and healthy this very day. If we thought that the only reason we should keep kosher was because it was healthy and that we could have figured this out just by observing what was healthy and what was not, then we would expect somebody eating pork would die and people eating insects would die. But in fact, you can live quite a healthy life eating both pork or insects. And would we think that the Torah, if this was its reason for prohibiting it, would be so wrong? No. Again, going back to our understanding of the author. Moreover, there are more dangerous animals and poisonous herbs which are not mentioned at all in the Torah. If the Torah was telling us stay away from pork because it's dangerous, well, what about fugu? What about the blowfish? What about the lionfish? Both of which are inherently kosher, but also are incredibly dangerous and poisonous. Not the kind of thing you want to have. Fugu is a very popular form of, well, not very popular, but a very esteemed form of sushi in Japan. And it comes from the blowfish, and if you serve the wrong part of the fish, you die. Japanese has some interesting eating habits. And if we thought that God was giving us kashrut just to keep us safe in what we're eating, then it should have said in big red letters in the center of the Torah, don't try to eat the blowfish. Eat all the fish in the world you like, but don't eat the blowfish. But that's not the way the Torah was written. That's not what it concludes. All of which points to the conclusion that the law of God did not come to heal bodies and seek their material welfare, but to seek the health of the soul and to cure its illnesses. Kashrut is a wise source of information for how to live our life in ways that we do not fully understand. But remember, our definition of wisdom is knowing the right thing to do at the right time in the right way. A lot of that we can figure out, but a lot of it, says Judaism, you're just going to have to take our word for it. And by our word, in this particular case, I'm talking about God's word. All right, onward. So maybe it's just a question of memorization, just a question of knowing what this is. Well, it is correct for a person to investigate the laws, to try and understand the minute reasons why God might have given this to us, the laws of the Holy Torah, and to know their purposes to the best of his abilities. And if he does not find a reason or a purpose in something, if you can't figure out what it is that kashrut is doing for us, you don't just say it's not wise, it's not good. He should not reject the commandments because he does not know their reasons, and should not attribute false ideas to God or think about them as though they were just mundane acts. Right, if someone comes to you and tells you, the best way to get more mileage from your car is to make sure that you are always in neutral when you come up to a red light. You've heard people who probably use this, right? Don't just put the clutch in. You got to put the car in neutral when you're coming up to a light. You got the other camp that says, no, you got to actually downshift each and every gear as you come up to a red light. There's massive arguments among people. My family growing up. Maybe you all live in different families. And if you can't prove one way or the other which one is right, big deal. And if you think one's right or rather the other's right, you just try and work it out and you do the best you can. That's mundane stuff. Torah is not like that. Just because you don't know doesn't mean you don't do. Because there is wisdom that is taking place and that is affecting and benefiting you even without your knowing.
Rabbi,
yes.
I'm sorry. You want to go back to before?
Yeah. By the way, this is Mishnah Torah from Rama.
Yeah, I don't understand the word. Mundane. What does that mean?
Mundane, whole.
Mundane.
Whole. The opposite of Kodesh.
Okay.
It's easy when it's good when you can translate in Hebrew. It makes it much easier. Because there's no good word for that in English, right? Mundane can work meaning for something that's not sanctified, but you can also use desanctified or desecrated or profane every day.
Yeah, I never heard that word.
Mundane?
Yeah,
See, you get English vocab when you come here too. It's bonus.
I'm a farmer.
No extra charge. Just make sure you use it on your SAT. All right, so to try and marry kashrut together with this idea of revealed wisdom, especially the oral law as transmitted by our sages, the Chazal we talked about, let's take a look at a case example. Book of Deuteronomy says, When the Lord your God enlarges your borders, meaning we've settled in the land of Israel as he has promised you, and you say, let me eat meat, because you long to eat meat, you may eat as much meat as your heart desires. And if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, meaning where the temple will stand, then you may slaughter from your herd and from your flock. Right? You don't have to go all the way to Jerusalem to have your lamb slaughtered just so you can have it for dinner a couple days later. Because once you're there, it's going to be much different than when you were in Sinai, when we were in the wilderness, and everybody lived in the same giant encampment. It doesn't work like that in the country. You're going to be spread out. And you'll slaughter it just as I have commanded you. And you may eat within your gates as much as your heart desires. Very straightforward, very simple, except there is no place in Torah that explains how to slaughter an animal. There is no verse in any of the 5 books of Moses that is, as I have commanded you, with regards to slaughter. Then where is it? Then where is it? It's in the Mishnah. It's in the oral law. The rabbis know exactly how to slaughter. There's never a question of how to slaughter in general. The questions are only on the minutiae of exactly which way to slaughter and which special circumstances require which special responses. But the rabbis say, yeah, this is the way you slaughter. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, we talked about before, as putting together the Mishnah, he said, and you shall slaughter as I commanded you. Well, that teaches that Moses was commanded on the food pipe, the esophagus, and the windpipe, the trachea, and the majority of one must be cut in a fowl. That means when you're slicing through the neck of the chicken, you've got to be able to go through at least the majority of the one. And when you're doing it for a mammal, it's got to be through both of them. That's what they mean by pieces. We're talking about mammals. And you would not know that about kashrut just from the Torah. But you would know there was a way you were supposed to do it. And you would be left going, oh, God says I can only eat it when I eat it in a certain way, but God hasn't told me here how I'm supposed to eat it. No, because God told your rabbi how to do it. Well, more specifically, God told Moses, and Moses explained. And once again, if you try to wrap all of the things that are explained within the oral law into the Torah itself, the book would end up being the size of a library. And just like the book of Proverbs, as we came back to, probably none of you would have ever read it. Whereas almost all of you in this room have read considerable portions of the Torah from one Shabbat to the next. Okay. So the wisdom of kashrut is received and reasoned. There is room for continued discussion, application of how we do this, but we also have to receive the fact that we are doing it. What and how to do it are impossible to know without the oral law, and meaning the record of the sages and their transmission of wisdom. The why and how it affects us, well, what does happen to us when we keep kashrut, that we continue to wrestle with. And we continue to find over and over again new wisdom in how kashrut works. And we continue to refine that by debate and discussion. Okay, let's move on to Shavuot. Time. And you will count from the morrow after the day of rest, meaning Pesach, according to rabbinic understanding. You might have misunderstood that if you didn't have the oral law. From the day that you brought the omer of the offering, 7 complete weeks. And the day after the 7th week will number 50 days, and you will offer a new grain offering to the Lord, from the book of Leviticus. That day when we offer the new grain offering is, of course, known as Shavuot. That's the holiday of Shavuot, which happens at the early summertime. Shavuot, in a sense, represents agricultural wisdom. The season of Shavuot marks the transition from the early harvest into the summer harvest. You get that early barley that comes in, the first grains that are sprouting after the winter, and barley's great because you're not starving, but it's not so great because no one eats barley if they can avoid it, because we'd much rather eat wheat. And wheat starts to come in this 7 weeks later at the time of Shavuot. And then you spend all of your summer, the time after Shavuot, harvesting and threshing and winnowing like mad to get everything in. And if you don't think it's that much of an effort, realize that's why we have summer vacation in schools. It's because you needed every single person in your family working on the farm, even up until the 20th century, to bring in everything that was needed. And Shavuot marked the beginning of that season. And it also marked a recognition that annually, 7 weeks after the barley came in, marked by Pesach, the wheat was going to come in. And you could count the days to know when you should start getting out there to harvest your wheat. And it also represented the first fruits of when the special produce that was uniquely sacred, but uniquely extolled within the land of Israel. The wheat, the barley, the grapes, the figs, the pomegranates, the olives, and dates would be offered as a special offering at the time. Shavuot is also connected to the book of Ruth, which takes place during this harvest season. And the book of Ruth is very special for Shavuot for two very good reasons. One, it's the right time of year, but two, it reflects the value of accepting the wisdom of Torah. Ruth, who is a non-Jew at the start of the story, comes to God in Judaism and makes a wise choice to join our people. She lives then a committed and knowledgeable Jewish life in a model of devotion that people have tried to emulate ever since. By coming to Torah for its wisdom, for the life that it will offer her, because at the time when she makes that choice, there is nothing else that Torah is going to give her. Nothing else becoming a Jew is going to give her. She's not going to get a husband out of this. She's not getting rich out of this. If anything, she's making her chances of future happiness, prosperity, success much, much lower. But because she knows that there is wisdom here that will improve her life, she makes the choice nonetheless, and it turns out great. But Shavuot is most well known as being a celebration of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And Shavuot, which is on the 6th day of Sivan, lines up implicitly, when you do the math, I'm happy to show someone a chart another time, with the giving of the Torah, or the Ten Commandments more specifically, as you can measure from the days of the Torah. Now, when you read in the Torah, when it says they left Egypt on this day, and then they traveled here, and then they traveled there, and then they traveled there, you do the math, and you end up on the 6th day of Sivan, 50 days later, after the Exodus from Egypt. The Torah doesn't say that Shavuot, which is 50 days after Pesach, is a commemoration of this. We have to figure it out, and then we have to pass that on to the next group, so that they don't have to do the math themselves. For which I'm eternally grateful to our ancestors of not making me do the math. Slight change. So why do we celebrate the giving of the Torah? Why do we celebrate this gift of revelation? I mean, after all, if God's wisdom was embedded in the world, remember all the way back at the beginning of Mishlei, that wisdom was there with God before the heavens were even laid, before the mountains were measured. Wisdom already existed. So if wisdom is embedded within the world, then surely it, crying to the marketplace, will be heard by every individual, and we'll be able then to access the wisdom. We can do it on our own, in the more Western concept of wisdom. Right? You live long enough and you pay attention, you'll be fine, you'll be wise. Why then should we celebrate the giving of the Torah? I mean, who needs it? We could have done it on our own. Well, because it's like the IKEA instruction booklet, right? Most of us, when we look at the world, when we look at life, we look like that poor little guy. Like, huh? How am I supposed to do this? How does this all fit together? And the giving of Torah at Shavuot is having our own personal helpline. The Torah is the customer service desk for living. I'm not sure what to do. I'm having trouble with my work, I'm having trouble with my spouse, I'm having trouble with my kids, I'm having trouble with life. What do? I look at Torah, and again, it's the biggest sense of that word. It's the written law, the oral law, the traditions, the explanations, the synthesis, the discussions, the debate, all of that together is what we mean by the wisdom that will help us make sense of all those pieces that we've got. And that permeates then everything we do in Judaism. right? In every realm, the pursuit and application of wisdom is found. In every holiday, in every act, in every mitzvah that we perform, wisdom is embedded as both the reason why we are doing it, because that wisdom has been shared and revealed from us, and the reason what we are gaining from it, that we gain more personal and unique wisdom by having engaged in that act, or having done that, or having learned that. And that continues to refine and enhance us and our understanding of the universe, and moves us and the world one step closer to redemption. That was the wrong button. Go away. Okay. So that we can, just to prove the punchline, consistently perform the right action at the right time for the right reason. That is the essence of Chochmah, the essence of us and our own personal attainment to wisdom. Any questions?
What about marriage and slavery? Why do they want? Is it a custom to eat dairy? Like Passover, you have unleavened bread. I mean, it's
Passover is explicit in the Torah,
it's very
unleavened bread.
explicit, but so it's been dairy for sure. I don't know
Why
why.
dairy for Shavuot? There is a teaching that says that God told us that we were not going to be able to eat meat unless it had been prepared properly. But the explanation of how to prepare it, as we saw, wasn't in the written, only came later. And so in the meantime, we ate dairy. Right? To be safe. If we don't know how to prepare the meat, then we eat meat substitute. We eat dairy. We eat the safe stuff. And so for Shavuot, as we are reliving the anticipation of the giving of Torah, we relive that moment of waiting for the wisdom, waiting for the knowledge, the understanding of what we can and can't do. Because that's what the gift of Torah is.
So back in Egypt, they not any meat?
Oh no, they ate all sorts of stuff. Before the giving of Torah, they didn't realize that they should or shouldn't. That's why it's called revelation.
Okay.
Because they didn't come to this conclusion on their own. And if they hadn't been given Torah, they would have continued to eat any old thing. And that's why, again, this notion of wisdom as being partly what is reason, and partly what is revealed, and partly what is reason about what has been revealed, is so important and intrinsic to every aspect of Judaism. Because you can't just do it on your own, and you can't just do it by observing and mimicking 100% what you have seen before you. You have to both learn, and you have to think, and you got to do it in every direction. And we do it together, as no one person is able to do this on their own. Which is why it's not so secret.
Rabbi, can you tell us why we cannot eat meat and milk together?
Why do we not eat meat and milk together? Because the Torah says so.
Why?
What's the reason? So, where are we going? Second. Don't want to go all the way there. Let's get down here. There. Okay. What and how to do it are impossible to know without the oral law, right? The Torah tells us, don't eat the kid boiled in the mother's milk. The oral law says, what does that mean? It means don't eat any meat that has been cooked with any dairy product. Right? That's unpacking that phrase. Why does it say not to do that? The Torah itself doesn't say, but our sages give explanations. The sages give wisdom for what is the benefit of avoiding this. For example, it's considered to be cruel, to be taking what was meant to be life and to be using it as a garnish, as a cooking method for what was taken from life. That seems a little callous. It's also been considered a pagan practice, where they would boil meat and milk as a symbolic form of capturing both life and death and other pagan nonsense. And we were not going to imitate them. So there are reasons that are given that we can then try to learn from, But, like I said, kashrut is one of the ultimate examples where we will not be able to even appreciate the wisdom embedded in many of these acts until long after they have had their influence on us. But I will say that one act of keeping meat and milk separate becomes a defining characteristic of how we organize our kitchens, of how we organize our meals, of how we put food in our mouth 3 times a day. And it means that we are carrying Torah in a way, just from that separation, regardless of the reason, that is inescapable. Because you have to remember, when did I last eat? What did I last eat? What am I going to be eating later? It becomes something that shapes the entire day, just from that mitzvah of keeping meat and milk separate. But there's more, but we can talk more later.
From health conditions, meat and dairy together, with diet. And
Interesting.
yeah, also Chinese never put them together.
Okay. So didn't know?
Yes.
But as Barbanel said, whether or not it has health benefits or not, we don't know. And certainly, as Rambam also said, we would be surprised if keeping kosher was unhealthy. And we shouldn't be surprised if keeping kosher provides the basics of nutrition and good digestion. But we shouldn't think that is the reason why God gave it to us. Of course, it's not going to be bad for us. But that's not the only reason why God would have given us the laws of kosher.
It would protect us. If you follow correctly, it could, if they help you, God's protecting.
Absolutely, but having both personally as well as witnessed of others, you can also be very, very unhealthy while eating kosher.
Oh, I know. So
There's an awful lot you can do to your body that's kosher that you shouldn't do to your body. So it's not a perfect nutrition system in that sense, but it is a very powerful spiritual system, even if we don't fully understand how it happens. My final example on this is that I'm going to turn off the mic and we can talk individually. For those of you that are old enough to remember watching Karate Kid, when Mr. Miyagi had Daniel-san doing, wax on, wax off,
oh, yeah.
right? Daniel-san had no idea that he was learning karate while he was doing that. But he needed to practice those motions 1,000 times before he could even begin to move to the next level. The same is true of kashrut and for many other mitzvot as well, that we may not fully appreciate the way this is transforming our instincts and our actions until much, much later. When we look back and see the impact, or we have reached that new step, and realize that without kashrut, without Shabbos, without tzedakah, without being honest with our business, we never would have reached that. We may have thought we were only doing it for mundane reasons or just because we were told so. We fail to appreciate the wisdom that was embedded in it. And we might even feel as frustrated as Daniel felt in Karate Kid. Like, hey, why am I your slave? You're making me work for you. I'm not making you work. I'm teaching you. It's just you wouldn't have sat still for the lesson, so I made you do this instead. And there is much to be said for that method of teaching. Although I don't think I've got my kids to wax my car. So, a reminder, our next Boundless Judaism course will be 2 weeks from tonight, right? Next week is December 31st, and we are expecting that many people are going to have other plans on New Year's Eve, and so we decided not to compete. And therefore you can enjoy the Gregorian New Year with a clear conscience. And we'll see you in 2 weeks' time for this class, but I hope, of course, to see everybody for Shabbos and all of our other activities at Temple Israel, most notably tomorrow's Mitzvah Day, where we have a number of in-house mitzvahs in-house mitzvahs and things off-site that you can help with. Beginning at 9 o'clock, we're doing some help in the youth lounge renovation, and then at 1 o'clock, doing many of our other baking, cooking, knitting, and other type mitzvahs here. Followed up by a lovely Chinese dinner, which is, of course, ultimate wisdom received from Mount Sinai itself of what we're supposed to do on the 25th of December.